Welcome to the Medical Support to Irregular Warfare podcast, an initiative to discuss and educate the evolution of medical support in peace, security, and conflict in uncommon environments. Points, perspectives, and opinions voiced here are solely those of the contributors and do not represent any formal association or government entity. We do everything possible to ensure the information and discussion is sound, comprehensive, and from the most credible sources.
G'day and welcome to the MSIW podcast. That's the Medical Support to Irregular Warfare podcast. My name is Martin. I am a member of the MSIW Committee of the Special Operations Medical Association. This episode is coming to you from the Australian Tactical Medicine Conference here in Brisbane, Australia. And I've got the great good fortune of talking to a couple of guys I've known for a few years who have a broad and deep level of experience in subjects that are very, very important to this topic. First, I've got Grummers. Grummers is a experienced field medic, SEMA, and medical planner who's worked extensively across the Pacific over the last 30 years, from small island clinics to medical elements supporting multinational missions. He's a certified paramedic with a host of specialty areas of training that includes rescue, remote casualty access, dive medicine, but he's also completed some postgraduate academic endeavors in disaster management through Stanford University, as well as global health development and health engagement at USU, and he's an international advisor on austere primary health care. Grummers, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. It's awesome to be here, and a solid opener with a g'day.
Excellent. I try and adapt when I'm deployed forward into the Indo-PACOM. We've also got Dr. Noel. Noel is an emergency medicine physician who has a vast level of experience throughout the Indo-PACOM theater of operations, working with troops at the unit level, working through command level, doing medical planning, and providing care throughout this vast and very complex theater. Noel, it's great to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me on the show, Mark.
Guys, I would like to start this episode by expressing a concern that I have and asking you for your input on it, and we'll just take it from there. I think that in the U.S. anyway, if we were to ask any given paramedic, any given military medic what irregular warfare and therefore what medical support to irregular warfare means to them, you'd get a variety of different answers, or you'd get a lot of confusion. This concerns me because if we start thinking about how we work in a combined fashion, working between allies and partners, if our terminology is at least not synchronized, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, we should and can respect that different allies and partners have a different take on things. But if we can't understand what we're saying to each other, there's potentially some problems. Can you describe for me, let's start with you, Grummers, can you describe for me what irregular warfare means to you from the world that you've lived and worked in, and how potential friction points between the Aussie view of things and perhaps the American view of things might be dealt with?
Well, it's a great question, Mark, and I think that, certainly to kick between the posts on definitions of things, when we're talking about medical support to these sort of, activities, if you want to call them that, is regardless of whether you've got like a humanitarian sort of organisation planning medical support, maybe it's a faith-based organisation or an outreach clinic, typically a lot of these systems are designed within a functioning health system. They have resources and infrastructure attributed to them. So, from point of injury to a medical treatment facility, there's like a competent, evacuation chain and resourcing to that. So in my mind, to answer your question, it's to do with medical support to those things that are outside of that infrastructure and that framework. So particularly when we're talking about the Pacific, we don't have evacuation chains, we don't have hard infrastructure, and we need to be able to provide a system that supports that.
Noel, do you have any perspective on that in terms of, have you seen friction between differences in doctrine and terminology amongst allies as you develop medical care plans?
Absolutely. I think there's it's a challenging area, and there seems to be a lot of, differences in opinion and perspective on what is irregular warfare? How does that compare with unconventional warfare? How does that, in the Australian context, what does special warfare look like? Is that something different? Is that something new, or is that something outside of that scope? And they kind of mean different things, and they include different aspects of that care. Leveraging from what Grummers was saying, I think that it clearly includes a broad inclusion of different topics, which is hard to necessarily succinctly condense into a single statement, which I'd love to provide. However, providing medical support, in some ways there are some similarities, in other ways there's not. There are medical evacuation systems, like we're talking about for the Indo-PACOM, but they are really stretched. They take days, and how that medical support works is different to other areas of the globe. So I don't think I'm answering your question specifically. Our medical support needs to conform to whatever the commander's going to do with their forces.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of these friction points can be mitigated just by working together and training together and exercising together. Yes. And just learning the different approaches that our allies and partners going in both directions will take as we prepare to deal with these problems. When you look at the definition of irregular warfare in current U.S. doctrine, it includes a number of different subsets, submissions, ranging from unconventional warfare through counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, counterterrorism, various forms of security assistance. Yep. That encompasses a lot right there. And I think what I'm hearing you saying is that there's commonalities in terms of preparing for and providing medical care to not only the military population, the diggers, the soldiers, yes, but all the other people that we're going to encounter during a campaign. Yes. There's commonalities that span all of those mission subsets. Yeah. Am I getting that right?
I think you are, and I think you've touched on the human terrain that is irregular warfare as well, with those the great range of populations, different types of populations, belief systems, cultures, languages across the area, and often very close in location, but quite different in their understanding of what healthcare looks like in their context. So yeah, I think those nuances are really what we need to appreciate as part of providing that medical support.
Well, this is my 6th trip to ATMC, the Australian Tactical Medical Conference, and brilliant conference, fantastic sharing opportunities. But these trips down here have really opened my eyes to the vastness of the Indo-PACOM theater. Wow, this place is big, 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 and there's a lot of aspects to doing military medical planning or any kind of resilience planning to support campaigns that most people have difficulty wrapping their brains around. Grummers, give me an idea of some of the top things that pop into your mind that make Indo-PACOM challenging.
Well, Mark, I think that we're talking about what is essentially the most logistically demanding and geographically dispersed environments on the Earth. Like the Pacific Islands is really what we're talking about is providing care that pushes the boundaries of what's medically acceptable. So within a population centre, where you've got an effective system for healthcare, but then when we talk about work in the Pacific Islands, we've got extremely long evacuation times, minimum access to infrastructure, and a lot of that infrastructure is pretty undeveloped. And so you've got the need for almost complete insufficiency. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the size of the Pacific, just to set the scene. So when we talk about Pacific Islands, we're not just talking about a region, we're talking about like one of the most geographic, vast and remote areas of the Earth. So it covers like a third of the planetary surface. We're talking like 165 million square kilometres. So to put that into perspective, from Palau in the west to Easter Island in the far east, that's over 10,000 kilometres, which is about the same distance from London to Cape Town. So like a 8 to 10 hour flight, or LA to Moscow. Not that we're going to be making that flight anytime soon. So we're talking about Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, which are all culturally widely different. Completely different languages, completely different history of colonies. It's a constellation of thousands of islands across the ocean that's so vast that Kiribati, which is a nation in itself, but Kiribati is less land than the size of New York, but a piece of ocean that's comparable to the size of India. So if you can imagine like evacuating people across those sort of distances, then it's completely different to any other portion of the earth. And so to put it into context, a flight from Honolulu to Samoa is the same distance as New York to LA. And then in between, say, Fiji and Tahiti, that's several hours in the aircraft. So if you're flying from Sydney to Fiji at 880 kilometres an hour, that's 4 hours with a tailwind. So bring us back to medicine, for medics and first responders and planners, the scale of the Pacific changes everything. So evacuation can take days. Communications, even with 5G and Starlink, is pretty limited. And in some places, you might be the only functioning healthcare provider for hundreds of kilometres, separated by seawater that goes to the horizon. For the listeners, if you can imagine delivering healthcare across that kind of distance where a helicopter can't reach you, a ship can't reach you, and the nearest hospital is 2 or 3 days away, your evacuation certainly isn't guaranteed, and you've got limited supplies, unreliable communications, and the tropical environment that's not just challenging, it's trying to kill you or consume you.
Something that pops into my head when you describe, the vast distances over open ocean is, it's a whole new spin on the tyranny of distance, right? Is you can have long evac chains that stretch across vast plains of land, but it's tough to defend your evac chains when they're crossing the ocean. So if you don't have air dominance, if your opposition has anti-access, area denial capabilities, integrated air defense systems, and so on, it makes those evac chains much more difficult to develop, sustain, and defend.
Yeah, and it goes the other way, of course, too, doesn't it? It's the logistics of supporting your teams out there as well. So what stuff needs to get out to those teams as well. So, right. Yeah, those distances are massive.
So I think that brings us to, like, when we're talking about delayed evacuation, so, heading toward prolonged field care, it's more than just a concept, it's a mindset, for our planning and for coming up with a plan for your patients. So it gets used a lot in tactical and humanitarian and academic sort of level medicine, but it means something very different for when you're living in the jungle or living on an island. It's about sustaining life and maintaining some capability or building capacity.
Something you guys said earlier, you were referring to the cultural challenges in this theater, the number of different nationalities, the number of different languages that are spoken, the complexities of working with indigenous partners are considerable. How do you see that historically? Are there historical examples of campaigning through, let's call it what was the Dutch West Indies at one point in time, now Indonesia, up into Southeast Asia? I know Australia has a long history of dealing with problems north of your country and up into Asia. How do those challenges contribute to delivering quality medical care?
Yeah, so I think those challenges are often historically grounded, and so before one might consider going into those different places, it would be wise to spend some time learning the history of colonialism and of the culture of those locations. And indeed, part of that is language. And from a medical end, some of the key aspects that I would want to appreciate would be their understanding of what good healthcare is, what constitutes good healthcare. So my experience in the Northern Territory would be that the retrieval of very sick or elderly patients from remote stations or localities would include people who would not want to leave their homeland, and therefore their evacuation wouldn't look the same as what we would, as Westerners, expect from an evacuation system. So understanding what their appreciation or their desires would be if they were severely injured. Would they be prepared to go to a third country for surgery and further rehabilitation? What are their beliefs around taking medications? How are we going to integrate often the presence of other medical systems already extant in their countries? How are we going to speak to the witch doctor or to the medicine man or other aid agencies or other providers in the area, so that we would ensure that we would integrate those and we would avoid unnecessary friction from arrangements before anything further happened, or before we would get ourselves into a situation where we would need to have those questions answered.
Well, some of the things you just brought up, it occurs to me that if the version of irregular warfare that we are supporting is counterinsurgency or foreign internal defense, then we are integrating with, perhaps working with, the indigenous medical system. So good area surveys, good understanding of the way medicine is delivered, what the limitations are, what infrastructure exists, how we can access that infrastructure not only for Class 8 resupply, but also potentially to take care of our casualties, or working, taking care of indigenous casualties amongst partners or just the indigenous population. That gets a little weird at times, I would imagine.
Oh, I think so, and and there's a whole that's a complex area, the one that you've just described. How do we trust what medications they've got access to? Are they reliable? Are they sterile? Have we got ability to deliver those things? Indeed, part of that would be blood and blood products, whether they are available and what some of the belief systems are around them. And then how do we optimise that to ensure that we are doing or practising in a safe way, that we're not going to get unnecessary casualties, and we're going to be able to effectively manage them if that occurs.
What sort of other aspects that are endemic to the theatre that a medical planner or a medical practitioner would have to think about? What's coming to my mind is a number of these subsets of IW imply it's inevitable that we're going to be dealing with the ill and the injured that come to us from non-battle related contexts. DNBI, disease, non-battle injuries. What diseases?
Absolutely. If you look at the write-ups of the Australian history in World War II, you'll see that there's a litany of issues, and the description of malaria as being the main enemy in working and operating in that area. Malaria absolutely decimated the troops and often would cause more casualties than would be experienced in direct conflict with the Japanese in that theatre. And so it's not just malaria, it's mosquito-borne diseases. So what else? Dengue fever, Ross River fever, Japanese encephalitis. Probably a few more that I can rattle off that mosquito-borne. And then there's the other issues around sanitation and hygiene as well, with procuring safe drinking water, making sure that your hygiene practices are safely adhered to, and so latrines, washing hands, procuring of food. Dysentery, for instance, was a major source of severe illness, and my understanding is that DNBI, those disease non-battle injuries, caused more deaths in World War II than did contact with the enemy. It seems to be a waste, particularly if it's preventable, and our job as medics is to appreciate what those threats might be and how to mitigate them, and indeed train to ensure that we aren't going to experience those.
Grummers, historically, is there any aspect of this theatre specifically that lends itself to a different injury pattern in terms of war wounds? Anything that you can anticipate from your planning or your experience operating here, or looking back historically? There's DNBI that Noel just discussed, but are war wounds going to look different during a campaign in Indo-PACOM?
Well, I think that's a pretty interesting question. I think that the physics of weapons don't really change when it comes to effect on the human body. But in those first few minutes, first few hours, first few days and weeks where someone has been wounded, and it doesn't have to be a war wound or a battle wound, it can be a palm front, it can be a car accident, dangerous marine animal of some sort. Living in an environment on some of these islands where the jungle itself is trying to consume you. The environment there is a cycle of decay. So even a small wound, particularly a penetrating wound, starts the clock on infection pretty quickly. And so I think it completely changes the way that we need to deal with even fairly minor wounds, notwithstanding those wounds that maybe go into the belly or the chest or even worse, the head, where once the jungle gets inside you, then the clock is ticking.
That's interesting. So, minor injuries that could have been handled very effectively at Role 1, soldier returned to duty and continue to provide their part of the campaign effort. Just because of the nature of this theater, infections happen faster, infections are worse, that might result in people needing either to be evacuated or needing much more extensive medical care than they otherwise might if the same injury had happened someplace else.
Yeah, for sure. I'll hand over to Noel in a sec. It's even just exposure to seawater for long periods of time, or being in mangroves, or being in a really humid, hot environment. Some of this is not medicine. Some of it is self-discipline. There's a lot of skills that we used to practice pretty regularly, and culturally a lot of these nations practice they're really particular about their wound care and care of their sick, because they know how quickly some of these processes can accelerate in that environment. But even if you're not hurt, just being exposed to seawater for long periods of time, you can develop all kinds of different problems associated with that. Some of them are disease, some of them are infection, some of them are like syndromes that work in the Pacific. It requires particularly clinicians, but also just people living in that environment to be super disciplined.
And if we're talking about moving casualties from one place to another, whether the evac chain is moving them to the rear or you're just moving them to a treatment facility on another island, in the environment where we don't have air dominance, we're moving them, it occurs to me, in small boats. We're exposing them to seawater in a way that we would not be if we were just stuffing somebody into a helicopter and moving them from island to island, or a large naval vessel where we can protect them better. We're using improvisational methods to move casualties where they're going to be exposed to some of these other cascading effects of exposure.
Those threats, particularly in the jungle, kind of touched on this already, but working in the jungle is a particularly difficult environment to work in. No doubt you've experienced some of that, but it's well known to degrade the human performance. The heat, humidity, rain, the darkness is very difficult to thrive in, and that's different to surviving. We're not talking about wanting to just survive, and it is about being able to effectively support our teams and make sure that they are combat effective, that they aren't degraded by all those things: water, heat, hydration, all the effects that you'll see from if you are out on the water, that's salt, wind, chafe, dehydration that we would kind of expect. But going back to your question about evacuation, it does require some adaptability and flexibility in options that may become available to you, whether it's from our World War II experience, the fuzzy wuzzies along the Kokoda Trail, all the way through to using improvised vehicles, platforms on the water. And I think it would be unusual to expect any form of air transport, but I think the reality is that we need to be thinking outside the box in terms of what we are doing with our casualties. If we do need to evacuate them, why are we evacuating them? Where do they need to go to and why? And if we can't move, can we bring resources to them? And if they can't move, then what resources or training do we need to effectively look after them?
Well, let me take that and cast this to both of you. But we've been talking about small islands. We've been talking about the littoral. We've been talking about managing the jungle. I'll throw some words at you. Jakarta, Manila, Singapore, big mega cities exist in this theater of operations. So some of these IW campaigns, whether it's unconventional warfare or counterinsurgency, are going to take place in the suburbs and in the middle of Taipei, or big, massive, well-developed cities. What are your thoughts on that? Medical support to irregular warfare in mega cities in Indo-PACOM.
Well, that's an interesting dynamic to consider, in that I think it depends on your access to the infrastructure in those mega cities. Now, I think that every city in the world can become a food desert, as an example. As soon as the infrastructure in that city is degraded, then their ability to take away trash, as you'd say in the US, your ability to get food, your ability to get water, these are not high-end concepts. We're talking about surviving. And then, as Noel was saying, thriving. And so if we were to try and provide support in those sort of places, particularly when travel to and from there is via the ocean, it doesn't take very long for these mega cities to degrade really quickly, especially if resources in competition. But then also to consider how quickly these mega cities in history have been swallowed by the jungle in a reasonably short amount of time from a historical perspective. There's vast cities that are buried under the jungle that were around hundreds or 1,000 years ago. It's not beyond my comprehension for particularly cities on island nations to be consumed as soon as the life supply, or as soon as the lifeblood of that city is taken away, then we'll see it.
These enormous cities, these mega cities, have developed in the last 70 years because of globalization and easy management of supply chains to enable something that enormous to develop over time. If you look back when it was harder to move stuff around, cities of that size typically did not develop.
No, but those cities traditionally come with protection, power, air conditioning, water, sanitation, access to food, health infrastructure. Those things would need to go through some sort of appreciation process before you want to include them in your planning around activities that you might need to support. Conceivably, they would then pose greater threats as a consequence, and medical needing to have some awareness of those threats in those environments with everybody's got a phone, everybody's got a camera. People can report. That then provides a different problem set to that provided by the remote location, typically.
Hey guys, I'd like to shift things a little bit. I think you've done a very effective job for the audience of just starting to paint a picture of the size and the complexity of Indo-PACOM, but I'd like to start looking at some potential solutions. How do we build capability? How do we sustain capability? And I'm not talking just within the defense point of view, but how do we anticipate where some of these conflicts might occur, and how do we assist those societies in becoming resilient? How do we encourage the development of infrastructure that we could then tap into potentially should we end up campaigning through that island chain or into that nation? Let's talk about developing capability. If the two of you had the authorities and the funding to create training systems, to create logistics systems that will help prepare for these types of campaigns, what's at the top of your priority list?
Well, I'm a pretty simple guy, Mark, and I think that I'd start with the characteristics of what makes a good health provider. So building a system based on the minerals that are within the humans in the system. So, having excellent clinical competence and confidence. So people being able to provide advice or provide training with a really good level of knowledge. That's a really good start. And then being adaptable to the environment, whether that's adaptable to the physical environment or the cultural environment, super important. Not only enables us to provide good medicine or to build good medicine in the communities that we're supporting, certainly to be able to prevent some of the problems that we face becoming bigger than they need to be. Certainly forcing our way into some of these communities is met with resistance, and we've seen that over history, particularly as you mentioned, after the Second World War. Or during the Second World War, there was a lot of great innovation done by people in these small islands, establishing networks based on mutual trust and excellent competence. But I think also, like when we're talking about capacity to provide health in these sort of operations, I think it's easy for people to have their gaze resting on this sort of high-end trauma management. Sure, there's trauma. If you go to Papua New Guinea, for example, machete wounds are really common. That is a complex injury that requires a pretty comprehensive system. But, for the everyday and for the preventative stuff, we need to have really sound nursing care. The ability to look after a human when they're most vulnerable and assist them in daily sort of faculties of life that underpins like a good health system. Good wound management, good hygiene, the ability to trend clinical vitals. All of these are individual things. It's not a thing you need to buy. It's not a thing that you need to carry. It's the characteristics that a person has in them and with them.
It sounds suspiciously to me that you are advocating for widespread, appropriate, prolonged field care training.
You're 100% correct. Yeah, and that doesn't need to be a course. That needs to be like a reclaiming of things that we used to do as fundamental to providing healthcare at the most basic level. So it's providing good medicine in bad places.
So when you say at the most basic level, are you talking about pushing it beyond just designated medical providers? So, medics on the civ side, or combat medics, corpsmen, or allied equivalents on the MIL side. How far down should PFC training or PCC training, if you're into the term prolonged casualty care, how far down should that be pushed?
I think every single person that steps out of their front door should be a medic. And I'm not talking about like certification or qualifications. Let's take, for example, if you're a climber and you're going to some remote mountain to climb that mountain, if you don't know how to take care of your own wounds or how to take care of your sanitation, how to look after yourself as part of a large team, you become a liability. And so what I'm advocating for is to have the discipline and the knowledge and the habitus to be able to look after yourself and look after your team around you. That's the fundamental of good medicine. And then each person that is in that region being able to have some knowledge of a whole bunch of these threats that we're talking about, how to recognise when a wound is infected or how to recognise disease processes when they're seeing them in their person sitting next to them.
So tactical combat casualty care, I'm going to get right back to you, Noel. I see that you want to jump in on this. But tactical combat casualty care is broken into tiers: all service member, combat lifesaver, combat medic corpsman, and combat paramedic are the accepted terms, certainly on the U.S. side. I think most of our allies have something very similar in terms of a tiered structure. Do you see prolonged field care having that same kind of tiered system? Should some variant of PCC or PFC be pushed down to all service members?
Yeah, and not just service members. I think anyone, like I said, anyone stepping outside their door in the Pacific region needs to have these sort of skills. And like, let's just say, for example, if we're a team of two and I'm hurt, and if you can understand how to recognise dehydration, or how to track like how much food I'm eating, or how much water I'm taking in, or how much fluid I'm losing. Like these are pretty basic skills, and trending and documenting to try and look after another human. You know, I think that these are kind of life skills that adults should have, that certainly every parent knows. That's not a course, that's a skill that you learn on how to look after another human and their basic needs.
Noel, what have you got to say about that?
Yeah, I've got a few opinions. I think if I were to describe it, I think that you've kind of touched on things, and when you've said, do we need to train people of different craft groups and tiers of experience medically in PFC, and I think in some ways that's a no-brainer. That's clearly going to need to be the case. I think that
I'm famous for my no-brainer comments.
Okay. You're very famous, Mark. So my understanding is that a lot of people in these countries already have an appreciation of how long it takes to get stuff done, to make things happen, to get diagnostics, to get treatments into them, how long it takes to call an ambulance, how long it takes to drive a road. They already have a good understanding of time. What maybe they don't have an appreciation for is what their anticipated clinical course is, because we are the medical providers. We know, we've seen people with bad wounds, bad infections. So we know the importance of really good first aid, and that transitioning into prolonged field care, and those important aspects of prolonged field care, that appreciation for, to touch on what you've mentioned already, Grummers, is around hydration, pressure area care, nutrition, toileting, wound care and wound redressing, all those sort of different aspects of looking after a casualty for a prolonged period of time, or somebody who's ill for a long period of time as well, and thinking through all the implications of those timeframes and how are you going to manage your time and space with the personnel and the equipment you've got.
So I'm looking across the table at a former SEMA, a former battalion doc. How do you explain this to a commander and convince that commander to make bandwidth and make budget to increase the levels of training for soldiers in these skill sets that are necessary to support irregular warfare operations in Indo-PACOM, specifically if there is a specific aspect to this theater, trying to get the chain of command to understand the importance of this. Can you put that into kind of a quick summary of advice to your colleagues? How do you get that message across that, hey, sir, we've got to carve out some more time to train on these unique aspects of the IW fight and the medical support to that fight?
Well, I think this would be true of any organisation, certainly external to the military. Any team, doesn't matter how big or small that team is. Everyone that knows me knows that I'm not a salesman, and so I wouldn't try and sell to a boss or to a commander that we need to buy a course or get some new bag or some new colour-coded system. What we're talking about is a cultural shift. So part of that cultural shift is exposure. So working in these sort of environments and getting the experience to be able to be disciplined and look after yourself, look after the people next to you. That's a cultural shift. So having experience working in the jungle or working in isolation is a set of skills that needs to be practiced. And then when we're talking about the medical components to that, is we don't need another drug, we don't need another protocol. We need the cultural shift of going away from, trauma management, still super important. We need to be able to take care of the most dangerous things that could happen to our people, but then shifting back to these things that are not particularly interesting to a lot of people, like looking after your feet, looking after your equipment, looking after the stuff that you have that you're responsible for. Those things in an environment like the Pacific, particularly in the jungle when you're wet, encouraging those sort of good behaviours that will sustain a group for periods of time that are unsupported, that's the answer. We don't need to send someone on some international delegation to learn how to do this.
So the senior NCO at the table is saying, drink water and change your socks. That's what I'm picking up here. Let me look at the doctor and say, that is actually fantastic advice. It has been since senior NCOs were telling Legionnaires to change their damn socks in Rome. But doctor, what comes to your mind as a high priority, capability changing, different approach that is necessary for us to think about and embrace and employ in terms of building up our preparedness for fighting IW campaign in the Pacific?
Yeah, so I think sort of building on from what Grummus is saying about exposure and experience, I think they are absolutely vital. I think the lens of history provides some really good appreciation for the potential threats that medical support in this area we're going to challenge us with. You know, what is going to be the effect of that? How bad is it going to be? And so those historical examples, and I know that some of the books are fairly long-winded in this day of AI, you can get summaries of different things, but appreciating what has happened before and what sort of experience they have had, acknowledging that we've now got much more in the way of antibiotics, our expectations around healthcare are greater. Those things still, the realities of the environment are still there. So those historical examples, I think, are critical. And then walking through case vignettes, I think, with the commanders around, okay, so if we get injured here, how long do you think it's going to take to carry a person X number of metres through this jungle, arrange a vehicle? Okay, let's just try and exercise different elements of that, get some idea of how long it's going to take to move them to a safe area where they can be provided some form of medical care right now. Okay, so how long do you think it's going to be before we can then move them any further? And then what happens, how are we going to be able to triage them and return them to the fight? Are we going to need to keep them somewhere else for them to rehabilitate? How is this going to work? A good understanding of different options needed, the why of evacuation, if that's available, if it's relevant, what the expectation is around evacuation and healthcare.
You just dropped the X word a moment ago, exercise. Do we have adequate exercises that challenge us to test our doctrine, test our training when it comes to specifically medical support to irregular warfare? In your opinion, are we exercising this adequately?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to provide a definitive answer, but my answer would probably be no.
Okay, that's always a challenge, right? It's tough to do realistic exercises that break your system and show you where the weak spots are. So there's so many capabilities to test. If the focus of this episode is for the medics and the clinicians who work down at unit level, if you could summarize the top three things, not only from this discussion, but anything that hasn't been brought up yet, the top three things that you would look at a colleague, you'd look at somebody taking over as the SEMA at a command, and you're on your way out, and you're giving them your last bits of good advice. Grummers, what would you say to somebody who's coming in to take over your desk in terms of, I wish I'd gotten these three things done better before I left?
Yeah, I've thought about this quite a bit, not just from provision of healthcare, but certainly to have an adventures in life. You need to cultivate a whole bunch of skills that enable you to be reasonably self-sufficient and self-reliant. That's not to say that the system, whichever system you're functioning in, won't support you, but What I'm talking about is understanding water, understanding hygiene, understanding, like self-care, which is a throwaway term these days. But then I'd extend that to like the equipment that you choose to carry with you. In my mind, if you can't fix it with a screwdriver and duct tape, then it's probably too complicated and won't survive in the Pacific for very long. And so having like your own repair kits and your understanding of your equipment so you can troubleshoot it, I think that's super important. And then cultivating a bunch of knowledge, whether you're taking it from history or whether you're taking it from current research, to arm yourself with really good decision-making tools. So when you have the absence of a textbook, absence of an app or someone to call, that you can at least take the first steps in making good decisions that can be confirmed through testing, evaluation, or the advice of the people around you to do the best for your team.
Doc, from the position of somebody who provides leadership and oversight to military medics, what are the things that pop out? If you can even narrow it down to 3, these need to be our highest priorities right now.
Okay, so I think number 1 is that you need the whole system to work. There's no point in loading up certain aspects, certain components of the system to work. You need the whole system to work. So that's your medical logistics, you need your blood program, you need your trauma system, you need your medical care, you need everything to work, at least to a reasonable degree. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that you want to empower your people to do well. So make sure they can thrive. So that's all your team members. So as a doc, your nursing officer, your medics, and it's really enabling, supporting them, doing everything you can to make sure they've got the right training, the right equipment, and they've got the right support mechanisms to look after them in the field. And understanding that you have that responsibility, and that goes to my 3rd one, is that the doc in the unit really needs to appreciate the weight of responsibility that their position has in ensuring that their guys are looked after. And you will do everything in your power to look after them, take care of them.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, gents, I appreciate your time. This is going to wrap up this episode of the MSIW podcast. Again, this episode is meant to be focused on the Role 1 unit level medical approach to irregular warfare preparedness across the whole spectrum, but specifically looking at the implications in the Indo-PACOM theater of operations. We have an upcoming episode where we're going to talk to another pair of clinicians from Australia, focused more on surgery far forward, advanced provision of care in austere environments, critical care evac, and some of those aspects of things. Less so at the unit level, more so at a higher level of acuity. Once again, thank you very much for tuning into the MSIW podcast. My name is Mark. I represent the Special Operations Medical Association's MSIW committee. And if you've got interest in this subject matter, I strongly encourage you to plug Special Operations Medical Association into your favorite search engine. Go to the website and look at how you can get involved. I would also like you to plug in the Australian Tactical Medical Association into that search engine and take a look at their efforts and take a look at when they schedule their annual conference. The ATMC is run typically every September to October. It varies a bit, but it's a brilliant conference. If you've got concerns about Indo-PACOM and you want to network with some of the key movers and shakers and some of the most experienced practitioners you're going to run into, make the effort to come down under, attend an ATMC. Please take good care of yourselves, good care of your teammates, and take good care of your casualties, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you for listening to this MSIW program, and we hope that you will both participate and contribute to the notes or offer thoughts, requests, and suggestions via our email link. The best to you, your work, and the relationships and security this effort strives to impact.